Welcome to part 2 of the presentation for Chapter 3, What is a Game? In this part I will highlight formal definitions of games, pragmatic definitions of games, and conclude with a brief discussion about gaming genres. Formal definitions are put forth in an attempt to understand games. Their aim is to be as consistent and precise as possible. Their purpose is to help refine our thinking of what activity is to be considered a game and to address their subconscious biases. Game historian David Parlett describes games as having two defining components, which are the ends and the means. With the term ends, he is referring to games as a contest, with a goal that only one player or one team can achieve, implying that a game always has a winner. With the term means, he is referring to the game's equipment and rules. This is a very strict and broad definition. It doesn't always apply to many games, for example World of Warcraft, in which the game cannot be won. An alternative definition is provided by Bernard Suits. He suggests that to play a game is to engage in activity directed toward bringing about a specific state of affairs, using only means permitted by rules, where the rules prohibit more efficient in favor of less efficient means, and where such rules are accepted just because they make possible such activity. Note that this definition is somewhat counterintuitive because it suggests that to enjoy ourselves we in fact seek rigid and restrictive structures. However, in their fairness, Parlett and Suits didn't specifically take into account what we considered as electronic video games today. One of the first scholars to seriously address video games was Chris Crawford in 1982. His model suggests that four features are common to all video games: representation, interaction, conflict, and safety. With representation, he means video games try to simulate external situations without actually having the player be a part of those external situations. His second feature, interactions, describes a feeling of engagement that a player feels with the ability to influence the world of the game and get back meaningful responses. Next feature present in all video games is conflict, which is or are the obstacles that block the game's goals. Lastly, all games have safety. With safety, he's referring to the fact that conflicts presented during the game do not carry the same consequences over to the real world. It's interesting to note that this was a definition that he put forth in 1982, about more than 20 years before scholars started to consider video game studies as a scholarly topic. More recent definitions of note include those provided by Katie Salen and Eric Zimmerman. They say that a game is a system in which players engage in an artificial conflict defined by rules that result in a quantifiable outcome. A second definition that expands on this idea is provided by Jasper Juhl. He suggests that a game is a rule-based formal system with a variable and quantifiable outcome, where different outcomes are assigned different values. The player exerts effort in order to influence the outcome. The player feels attached to the outcome, and the consequences of the activity are optional and negotiable. It's interesting that both of these definitions stress some of the same points. They both consider games as a system, which involves a quantifiable outcome. I want to point out a few things about Juhl's definition by looking at his model. This over here is his game model. It's used to determine what is to be considered a game and what is not to be considered a game. The inner slices represent the attributes of the classical video games. These classical video games have fixed rules, variable outcomes, valorization of outcomes, player effort, player attachment to outcomes, and negotiable consequences. The middle portion labels attributes for the borderline cases, games that are only marginally considered to be games fall into this category. This is where the paper and pen games would fall in. A lot of these games are often based on pure chance, where minimal or no player effort is needed. The outermost portion is for activities that completely fall outside the classical game model. Activities such as storytelling, Ring of Roses, and watching a fireplace are the type of activities that fall into this category. These activities don't fulfill some or even any of the criteria found in the inner slices. Keep in mind that the point of this formal definition is not necessarily to provide the absolute definition for games, but it's to acknowledge and specify the different perspectives that one can have when studying video games. Now we're going to focus on pragmatic definitions. which aren't as rigorous as formal definitions. And keep in mind that the purpose of these pragmatic definitions is to serve as tools for actual game design and creation of new video games. These definitions are more open and casual and aren't meant to be very philosophical as opposed to formal definitions. One such definition is provided by Sid Meier. He states, "A game is a series of interesting choices." This definition is very simple to understand, but it's very limited in terms of its scope. Another recent pragmatic definition of video games comes from the MDA model. This model divides games into three dimensions: mechanics, dynamics, and aesthetics. Mechanics are the rules and the basic coding that define a game. That's typically all the background stuff that a player doesn't see. The dynamics of a game are the ways in which the game is played based on the mechanics, and these are the events that can occur during the course of a game. Lastly are the aesthetics, which cover the favorable emotional responses evoked by a player as a player is playing the game. Some of these favorable responses that attract us towards video games are different sensations, fantasies, narratives, challenges, fellowship, discoveries, expression, and submission. This MDA model is useful for understanding and discussing the way that games work. These pragmatic definitions aren't perfect, but they can be powerful tools for thought and to inspire video game design. The last topic that this video will cover is the issue of genres. Scholars have tried to categorize games into genres because observation or implications of video games often only apply to certain types of video games. So rather than suggesting that video games in general have a strong correlation with X, by categorizing games, they could say that only video games of genre Y are strongly correlated to outcome X. Mark Wolf has a criteria for categorizing video games based on the player video game interactivity. He suggests that interactivity is an essential part of every video game structure and a more appropriate way of examining and defining video game genres. But the problem with this criteria is that he came up with an outline of 43 distinct genres, many of which are only vaguely linked to his criteria. Another way to categorize video games is provided by Espen Arseth. He suggests that video games shouldn't be defined based on one specific variable, such as interactivity, but based on a series of different variables. But up to this point, this system hasn't been of much practical use. As we know today, many video game magazines and video game stores such as GameStop have their own categories and own genres which are loosely based. With that said, the authors of our textbook have also defined their own criteria of categorizing video games. Their genre system is based on asking, what does it take to succeed in a game? This system focuses on the goals of video games and how to achieve those very goals. This system that they came up with has these four basic genres: action games, adventure games, strategy games, and process-oriented games. And that pretty much wraps up this chapter on defining what is a game. Just a review, we went over a few formal definitions, some pragmatic definitions, and a few different criteria for categorizing video games. I'm Samit Gogna, and I want to thank you for watching this video. Goodbye.